Hello and welcome to the podcast. This is Ron's Amazing Stories, where we play tales to take you away from today. Welcome to the new year, and new podcasts in general.
I'll be the judge of that.
I'm sure you will. On today's show, we have some amazing stories.
Amazing!
We have a Bigfoot story from the Pacific Crest Trail, a medieval science fiction story sent in and read by Corey Snow, and Tom tells us what it's like from the other side of the green grass.
Hey, that's pretty good.
It is, isn't it? So, why not start it with a 5-minute mystery that checks all of the boxes?
Cool, man!
Another 5-minute mystery.
This 5-minute mystery is being brought to you by How Did You Know? Have you ever been talking with someone only to have them say something that you already knew? The usual response you get is, how did you know? We are bringing you this mystery by knowing that you knew that. Now, on to the show.
This must be a big case we're headed for, Inspector.
Well, you're right in a way, Stokes. I've known old Sherry, the man who's been murdered, for a long time.
Isn't he the guy who owned a lot of diamonds?
Yes, he had several very valuable ones in his collection. And I think somebody killed Sherry for those diamonds.
Any idea who?
We'll find that out after we get inside.
Oh, hello, Inspector Crothers. I'm glad you got here so soon.
Oh, hello, Dr. Matthews. I brought Sergeant Stokes along to help.
Fine. Come on in, won't you? The man who phoned me, Mr. Sayers, is in the study where they found Sherry.
We'll come along after you, Doctor.
Inspector Crothers, this is Mr. Sayers who found Mr. Sherry unconscious when he came in.
How do you do, Mr. Sayers?
Holy Moses, look at this place. Looks as though a cyclone had struck it.
Now, tell us what happened, won't you, Mr. Sayers? I'd like to get the story straight.
Well, in a very confidential capacity, I represent a large diamond buying syndicate. Mr. Sherry was known to have a very extensive collection of gems, one specimen in particular that our firm wanted to buy.
And you were sent to see if he would sell it?
That's right. I made an appointment with Mr. Sherry for this evening. He said to come here and that he might be back here in the study and not hear the bell. If no one answered, I was to come right in. He would leave the door unlocked for me.
Isn't that a rather strange thing for a man to do who has a valuable collection of diamonds in his house?
Well, I thought so at the time, but I thought also that Mr. Sherry was perhaps, eccentric. You see, I'd never met him, nor, as a matter of fact, heard of him until yesterday. I come from another part of the country, you see.
And he was alone?
Completely. You can imagine how shocked I was at finding Mr. Sherry lying on the floor by the desk, unconscious, and the room all upset.
When Mr. Sayers phoned me, I imagined that Sherry was suffering from one of his chronic attacks. However, I find that the man has been hit at the base of the skull by a powerful blow, breaking his neck and killing him instantly.
You say you were familiar with Mr. Sherry's chronic attacks, Doctor?
Yes, I've been Mr. Sherry's personal physician for many years.
That was why I phoned Dr. Matthews, Inspector. I knew that he would be able to offer the best help.
Mr. Sayers, your theory is a very nicely calculated one. In fact, I would have acted on it if it hadn't been for one thing. As it is, though, I'm holding you for the murder of Mr. Sherry and for the attempted theft of his diamond collection.
What mistake did Sayers make that caused the inspector to hold him on a definite charge of murder? In just a moment, we'll tell you, but first...
Okay, now, if you remember the opening to this mystery, then you have all the clues you need to solve it. I'm going to go on record and say that this one is very clever and goes down as one of the better 5-minute mysteries that we've had. So take a second and ask yourself, how did he know?
And now, back to our 5-minute mystery.
Hold me for murder? Why, Inspector, I told you...
I know, Mr. Sayers. You told me a little too much. When you said you had never met Sherry, nor heard of him until a day ago, everything was fine. But when you said you called his personal physician purposely, you caught yourself. If you knew nothing about Sherry, you couldn't have known who his personal physician was.
Say, Inspector, that's pretty clever. Pretty clever.
Not bad. This story had it all. Motive, the diamonds. Opportunity, he was alone with the guy. And means, we don't know what he used to bash poor old Sherry's head in, but I'm pretty sure they'll find it. A full-featured mystery. How about that? And it was brought to you by How Did He Know?
Is that you say?
Well, I have to say, welcome to the new year. There are going to be some fantastic changes to the podcast this coming year, one of which debuts on this very program. Tom Williams has been bringing us his story for some time under the segment As Read By. Beginning today, Tom has his very own segment called Growing Up. As Read By is going to stick around, but it is also going to get a facelift this year. More on that later. Speaking of new segments, I just signed some new/old talent for the show. Coming this month is Ghost Stories with Sylvia. Those of you who have been around know that this has been a mainstay for the spooky season for the last 5 years. Starting this month, it is going to be a 15-minute monthly segment with author Sylvia Schultz. Can't tell you how excited I am about this, and Sylvia also has expressed how much she is looking forward to it as well. She is the best ghost storyteller available, bar none. That's not all the news here at the podcast. We're looking at adding advertising to the show. I know that many of you are saying no, but I will make you this promise. It will be good stuff, things I believe in and have checked out. On last week's Horror Express, you heard the first of these. Gladys Goodies made their debut as a sponsor with their short commercial. Now, if you have something you want to sell or promote on Ron's Amazing Stories, please contact us at ronsamazingstories@gmail.com and tell us all about it. All submissions will be considered. Finally, I'm excited to tell you about a new way to tell us your story. Coming soon to Ron's Amazing Stories is a hotline. Many of you have been asking for an easier way to tell your stories on the show. Soon, all you're going to have to do is pick up your phone and dial. You'll be able to record your stories in your own voice, make comments, or ask me questions about anything without having to write a thing. This is going to be a test service at first. My concern is that it's going to get abused and may not be practical. More on this later as I iron out the details, but be looking for it very soon. Thank you for listening to this. Now let's get back to the show with These Are Your Stories.
These are your stories, sent by you, for you.
This week we have a great story sent in by Jeremy Vaughn from Buffalo, New York. I received this story in 2 parts. I think you'll know what I mean in a second. Here is Jeremy's first email. Hello, Ron. Love your show and tell everyone that will listen about it. Also, I love your artwork each week. I look forward to that almost as much as I do the podcast. Thank you for both. I have a story to tell you, but I'm also working on a book I call Jeremy's Story. I want to use this there and would rather not lose the rights to it to you. Can we have the best of both worlds type thing? Jeremy. Well, I immediately replied with this. Yes, we can. Certainly we can have the best of both worlds. By allowing me to tell your story does not mean you lose the right to tell it yourself. Think of it this way. Two guys have a UFO experience together in the Tuscany Mountains. They both decide to write a book about their experience. Both books tell the same story, but yet are completely independent copyrights. The same thing applies here. Yes, I own the rights to my show, but you own the rights to your book. You couldn't include my podcast in your book without my permission, and I can't read your book on the show without your approval. So please send in your story, and I will share it with everyone. I'm still surprised by how many people worry about this. Last year, I had to drop a story that was both inspirational and amazing because in the end, the person wouldn't believe that simple truth. I don't own anything except the rights to my own show. So please, if you have a story, don't let that be the reason you don't send it in. You don't lose your copyrights. Now, for the good news. Let's hear Jeremy's story. I think you're going to find it incredibly amazing. It was the summer of 2005, and I was on a backpacking trip in your neck of the woods, the Pinchot National Forest. I've always wanted to do at least part of the Pacific Crest Trail. It spans over 2,600 miles from Mexico to Canada through California, Oregon, and Washington. It reveals the beauty of the desert, unfolds the glaciated expanses of the Sierra Nevada, travels deep into the forests, and provides commanding vistas of the volcanic peaks in the Cascade Range. Now, I didn't write that. That was directly from their homepage. We found a nice hotel in the city of Stevenson, Washington, and spent our first couple of days there packing and making final preparations for the trip. I would be going with my older brother James and my younger sister Jenny. Yes, all our names begin with J. My dad is Jerry, and my mom is also a Jenny. Anyway, we hired a local to come pick us up at the Mount St. Helens Monument some 5 days hence. That would mean we would be hiking about 30 miles, give or take. Excited, we hired a cab to take us out the next morning to the beginning of the Pinchot Forest and the Pacific Crest Trail. Hiking is a wondrous thing. You can never know what is going to be around the next bend. All sense of time, life issues, and problems fade away with each step. We saw many wondrous things, all documented via camera or journal entries. The fact was, we were no longer an executive, art dealer, and financial consultant. We were just 3 siblings out in the world, just as God meant us to be. We had moments of fun, heart-pounding vistas, and even a black bear encounter. But nothing prepared us for that third night out. We had just finished making camp, and Jenny was working on the evening meal when the first scream came out of the darkness. I can't describe the sound exactly, but think of a male screaming at the top of their lungs, then lower that by several octaves. It bellowed through the forest like an explosive thunderstrike, and then faded away. It was replaced by an eerie silence that lasted for several seconds. Then, a second scream, this one higher than the first, and it echoed from a different location. It was followed by sounds that can only be equated as the beating of a drum. Perhaps a hollowed-out log or dead trees, who can say, but there was some sort of rhythm to it. This too stopped and then was responded to with a third scream from even further away. Then everything went quiet. And when I say quiet, I don't mean forest sounds quiet. It was dead silence. Not a single sound came from around us. It was as if the entire world had stopped in that very moment. We all agreed not to bring any sort of electronics with us, so we had no real way of knowing how long it lasted, but eventually the normal night sounds returned and things were set to right. We went back to our evening activities, dinner, a game of cards, general chatter, and even a deep discussion of what had happened. The rest of the night, and the trip for that matter, was uneventful. We had the time of our lives and never regretted a single moment of our adventure. When I returned home, I decided to look up to see what may have been the cause of the scream and drums. The only explanation offered was that we had encountered and intercepted Bigfoot communication. That's right, Bigfoot Calling Bigfoot. Jeremy Vaughn, Buffalo, New York. Wow, thank you, Jeremy, for your story. I have to say I've hiked that very same area many times in my life, although I've only gone about 7 miles into the Pinchot National Forest. The trail begins very close to the famous Bonneville Dam on the Columbia River. I've never had the pleasure of an encounter with Bigfoot, but I've heard many stories similar to yours told to me by people that I respect. I've always believed that there is something there. If you want to know more about the Pacific Crest Trail or Bigfoot encounters that have happened in the region, I will have links to both in the show notes. To Jeremy, I say, man, I can't wait to read your book. If this is a sample of what we can expect, please get to it sooner than later. We have a story today that is, well, different from anything that we've ever had before. It is a period piece, but of science fiction stuff. It could be considered controversial, but it's too darn good to not play it. I received this email from Corey Snow of Chula Vista, California. Hello, Ron. I have a story for the show that if you just listened to its beginning, you would reject it out of hand. Also, there are parts of it that might offend some people. Please look past all of that and listen to the entire project. It is an amazing story and it should be heard. It was written by Randall Garrett. I know that you like his stuff because you recently played his entire novel, Anything You Can Do. So, give it a chance. I have attached a recorded version for you, Corey. Well, I did give it a listen, and Corey's right. This is an impressive tale. Before I play it, I want to say 2 things. First, give this one a chance. The beginning is dry, but with reason. You see, it'll all make sense once you've heard the whole thing. Second, I do not support the habit of smoking, nor do I wish to glamorize its use. The story is called After a Few Words and was published in Analog Magazine in the October of 1962 edition. It is read for us by Corey M. Snow. Take it away, Corey.
After a Few Words by Gordon Randall Garrett. This is a science fiction story. History is a science. The other part is, as all Americans know, the most fictional field we have today. He settled himself comfortably in his seat and carefully put the helmet on, pulling it down firmly until it was properly seated. For a moment, he could see nothing. Then his hand moved up and, with a flick of the wrist, lifted the visor. Ahead of him, in serried array, with lances erect and pennons flying, was the forward part of the column. Far ahead, he knew, were the Knights Templars, who had taken the advance. Behind the Templars rode the mailed knights of Brittany and Anjou. These were followed by King Guy of Jerusalem and the host of Poitou. He himself, Sir Robert de Bouain, was riding with the Norman and English troops just behind the men of Poitou. Sir Robert turned slightly in his saddle. To his right, he could see the brilliant red and gold banner of the lion-hearted Richard of England. Gules impale 3 lions passant gaudant, or. Behind the standard-bearer, his great war-horse moving with a steady, measured pace, his coronet of gold on his steel helm gleaming in the glaring desert sun, the lions of England on his firm-held shield, was the king himself. Further behind, the Knights Hospitallers protected the rear, guarding the column of the hosts of Christendom from harassment by the Bedouins. "By Our Lady," came a voice from his left, 3 days out from Acre, and the accursed Saracens still elude us. Sir Robert de Bouain twisted again in his saddle to look at the knight riding alongside him. Sir Gaeton de l'Arc-Tombé sat tall and straight in his saddle, his visor up, his blue eyes narrowed against the glare of the sun. Sir Robert's lips formed a smile. "They are not far off, Sir Gaeton. They have been following us. As we march parallel to the sea-coast, so they have been marching with us in those hills to the east." "Like the jackals they are," said Sir Gaeton. "They assail us from the rear, and they set up traps in our path ahead. Our spies tell us that the Turks lie ahead of us in countless numbers, and yet they fear to face us in open battle." "Is it fear, or are they merely gathering their forces?" "Both," said Sir Gaeton flatly. "They fear us, else they would not dally to amass so fearsome a force. If, as our informers tell us, there are uncounted Turks to the fore, and if, as we are aware, our rear is being dogged by the Bedouin and the black horsemen of Egypt, it would seem that Saladin has at hand more than enough to overcome us, were they all truly Christian knights. Give them time. We must wait for their attack, Sir Knight. It were foolhardy to attempt to seek them in their own hills, and yet they must stop us. They will attack before we reach Jerusalem, fear not." "We of Gascony fear no heathen Mussulman," Sir Gaeton growled. "It's this hellish heat that is driving me mad." He pointed toward the eastern hills. "The sun is yet low, and already the heat is unbearable." Sir Robert heard his own laugh echo hollowly within his helmet. "Perhaps 'twere better to be mad when the assault comes. Madmen fight better than men of cooler blood." He knew that the others were baking inside their heavy armor, although he himself was not too uncomfortable. Sir Gaeton looked at him with a smile that held both irony and respect. "In truth, Sir Knight, it is apparent that you fear neither men nor heat, nor is your own blood too cool. True, I ride with your Normans and your English, and your King Richard of the Lion's Heart. But I am a Gascon, and have sworn no fealty to him. But to side with the Duke of Burgundy against King Richard?" He gave a short, barking laugh. "Ha! I fear no man," he went on, "but if I had to fear one, it would be Richard of England." Sir Robert's voice came like a sword, steely, flat, cold, and sharp. "My lord the king spoke in haste. He has reason to be bitter against Philip of France, as do we all. Philip has deserted the field. He has returned to France in haste, leaving the rest of us to fight the Saracen for the Holy Land, leaving only the contingent of his vassal, the Duke of Burgundy, to remain with us. And Richard of England has never been on the best of terms with Philip Augustus," said Sir Gaeton. "No, and with good cause. But he allowed his anger against Philip to colour his judgment when he spoke harshly against the Duke of Burgundy. The Duke is no coward, and Richard Plantagenet well knows it. As I said, he spoke in haste." "And you intervened," said Sir Gaeton. "It was my duty." Sir Robert's voice was stubborn. "Could we have permitted a quarrel to develop between the two finest knights and war leaders in Christendom at this crucial point? The desertion of Philip of France has cost us dearly. Could we permit the desertion of Burgundy too? You did what must be done in honor, the Gascon conceded, but you have not gained the love of Richard by doing so. Sir Robert felt his jaw set firmly. My king knows I am loyal. Sir Gaeton said nothing more, but there was a look in his eyes that showed that he felt that Richard of England might even doubt the loyalty of Sir Robert de Bouain. Sir Robert rode on in silence, feeling the movement of the horse beneath him. There was a sudden sound to the rear. Like the wash of the tide from the sea came the sound of Saracen war cries, and the clash of steel on steel mingled with the sounds of horses in agony and anger. Sir Robert turned his horse to look. The Negro troops of Saladin's Egyptian contingent were thundering down upon the rear. They clashed with the Hospitallers, slamming in like a rain of heavy stones, too close in for the use of bows. There was only the sword against armor, like the sound of 1,000 hammers against 1,000 anvils. "Stand fast! Stand fast! Hold them off!" It was the voice of King Richard, sounding like a clarion over the din of battle. Sir Robert felt his horse move, as though it were urging him on toward the battle, but his hand held to the reins, keeping the great charger in check. The king had said, "Stand fast," and this was no time to disobey the orders of Richard. The Saracen troops were coming in from the rear, and the Hospitallers were taking the brunt of the charge. They fought like madmen, but they were slowly being forced back. The master of the Hospitallers rode to the rear, to the king's standard, which hardly moved in the still desert air now that the column had stopped moving. The voice of the Duke of Burgundy came to Sir Robert's ears. "Stand fast! The king bids you all to stand fast," said the Duke, his voice fading as he rode up on the column toward the Knights of Poitou and the Knights Templars. The master of the Hospitallers was speaking in a low, urgent voice to the king. "My lord, we are pressed on by the enemy and in danger of eternal infamy. We are losing our horses, one after the other." "Good master," said Richard, "it is you who must sustain their attack. No one can be everywhere at once." The master of the Hospitallers nodded curtly and charged back into the fray. The king turned to Sir Baldwin de Carrero, who sat a horse nearby and pointed toward the eastern hills. "They will come from there, hitting us in the flank. We cannot afford to amass a rearward charge. To do so would be to fall directly into the hands of the Saracen." A voice very close to Sir Robert said, "Richard is right. If we go to the aid of the Hospitallers, we will expose the column to a flank attack." It was Sir Gaeton. "My lord the king," Sir Robert heard his voice say, "is right in all but one thing. If we allow the Egyptians to take us from the rear, there will be no need for Saladin and his Turks to come down on our flank. And the Hospitallers cannot hold for long at this rate. A charge at full gallop would break the Egyptian line and give the Hospitallers breathing time. Are you with me? Against the orders of the king? The king cannot see everything. There are times when a man must use his own judgment. You said you were afraid of no man. Are you with me?" After a moment's hesitation, Sir Gaeton couched his lance. "I am with you, Sir Knight. Live or die, I follow. Strike and strike hard." "Forward, then!" Sir Robert heard himself shouting. "Forward for St. George and for England!" "St. George and England!" the Gascon echoed. The two great war horses began to move ponderously toward the battle lines, gaining momentum as they went. Moving in unison, the two knights, their horses now at a fast trot, lowered their lances, picking their Saracen targets with care. Larger and larger loomed the Egyptian cavalrymen as the horses changed pace to a thundering gallop. The Egyptians tried to dodge as they saw, too late, the approach of the Christian knights. Sir Robert felt the shock against himself and his horse as the steel tip of the long ash lance struck the Saracen horseman in the chest. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw that Sir Gaeton, too, had scored. The Saracen, impaled on Sir Robert's lance, shot from the saddle as he died. His lighter armor had hardly impeded the incoming spear point, and now his body dragged it down as he dropped toward the desert sand. Another Moslem cavalryman was charging in now, swinging his curved saber, taking advantage of Sir Robert's sagging lance. There was nothing else to do but drop the lance and draw his heavy broadsword. His hand grasped it, and it came singing from its scabbard. The Egyptian's curved sword clanged against Sir Robert's helm, setting his head ringing. In return, the knight's broadsword came about in a sweeping arc, and the Egyptian's horse rode on with the rider's headless body. Behind him, Sir Robert heard further cries of "St. George and England!" The Hospitallers, taking heart at the charge, were going in. Behind them came the Count of Champagne, the Earl of Leicester, and the Bishop of Beauvais, who carried a great war-hammer in order that he might not break church law by shedding blood. Sir Robert's own sword rose and fell, cutting and hacking at the enemy. He himself felt a dreamlike detachment, as though he were watching the battle rather than participating in it. But he could see that the Moslems were falling back before the Christian onslaught. And then quite suddenly there seemed to be no foeman to swing at. Breathing heavily, Sir Robert sheathed his broadsword. Beside him Sir Gaeton did the same, saying, "It will be a few minutes before they can regroup, Sir Knight. We may have routed them completely. Aye, but King Richard will not approve of my breaking ranks and disobeying orders. I may win the battle, and lose my head in the end." "This is no time to worry about the future," said the Gascon. "Rest for a moment and relax, that you may be the stronger later. Here, have an Old King's." He had a pack of cigarettes in his gauntleted hand, which he proffered to Sir Robert. There were 3 cigarettes protruding from it, one slightly farther than the others. Sir Robert's hand reached out and took that one. "Thanks. When the going gets rough, I really enjoy an Old King's." He put one end of the cigarette in his mouth and lit the other from the lighter in Sir Gaeton's hand. "Yes, sir," said Sir Gaeton, after lighting his own cigarette. "Old Kings are the greatest. They give a man a real, deep-down smoking pleasure." "There's no doubt about it. Old Kings are a man's cigarette." Sir Robert could feel the soothing smoke in his lungs as he inhaled deeply. "That's great. When I want a cigarette, I don't want just any cigarette." "Nor I," agreed the Gascon. "Old Kings are the only real cigarette when you're doing a real man's work." "That's for sure." Sir Robert watched a smoke ring expand in the air. There was a sudden clash of arms off to their left. Sir Robert dropped his cigarette to the ground. "The trouble is that doing a real he-man's work doesn't always allow you to enjoy the fine, rich tobaccos of Old Kings right down to the very end." "No, but you can always light another later," said the Gascon knight. King Richard, on seeing his army moving suddenly toward the harassed rear, had realized the danger, and had charged through the Hospitallers to get into the thick of the fray. Now the Turks were charging down from the hills, hitting, not the flank as he had expected, but the rear. Saladin had expected him to hold fast. Sir Robert and Sir Gaeton spurred their chargers toward the flapping banner of England. The fierce warrior King of England, his mighty sword in hand, was cutting down Turks as though they were grain stalks, but still the Saracen horde pressed on. More and more of the terrible Turks came boiling down out of the hills, their glittering scimitars swinging. Sir Robert lost all track of time. There was nothing to do but keep his own great broadsword moving, swinging like some gigantic metronome as he hacked down the Moslem foes. And then suddenly he found himself surrounded by the Saracens. He was isolated and alone, cut off from the rest of the Christian forces. He glanced quickly around as he slashed another Saracen from pate to breastbone. Where was Sir Gaeton? Where were the others? Where was the red and gold banner of England? He caught a glimpse of the fluttering banner far to the rear and started to fall back. And then he saw another knight nearby, a huge man, who swung his sparkling blade with power and force. On his steel helm gleamed a golden coronet. Richard. And the great king, in spite of his prowess, was outnumbered heavily, and would within seconds be cut down by the Saracen horde. Without hesitation, Sir Robert plunged his horse toward the surrounded monarch, his great blade cutting a path before him. He saw Richard go down, falling from the saddle of his charger, but by that time his own sword was cutting into the screaming Saracens, and they had no time to attempt any further mischief to the king. They had their hands full with Sir Robert de Bouain. He did not know how long he fought there, holding his charger motionless over the inert body of the fallen king, hewing down the screaming enemy, but presently he heard the familiar cry of, "For St. George and for England!" behind him. The Norman and English troops were charging in, bringing with them the banner of England. And then Richard was on his feet, cleaving the air about him with his own broadsword. Its bright edge, besmeared with Saracen blood, was biting viciously into the foe. The Turks began to fall back. Within seconds the Christian knights were boiling around the embattled pair, forcing the Turks into retreat, and for the second time Sir Robert found himself with no one to fight. And a voice was saying, "You have done well this day, Sir Knight. Richard Plantagenet will not forget." Sir Robert turned in his saddle to face the smiling king. "My lord king, be assured that I would never forget my loyalty to my sovereign and liege lord. My sword and my life are yours whenever you call." King Richard's gauntleted hand grasped his own. "If it please God, I shall never ask your life. An earldom awaits you when we return to England, Sir Knight." And then the king mounted his horse and was running full gallop after the retreating Saracens. Robert took off his helmet. He blinked for a second to adjust his eyes to the relative dimness of the studio. After the brightness of the desert that the Televicarian helmet had projected into his eyes, the studio seemed strangely cave-like. "How'd you like it, Bob?" asked one of the two producers of the show. Robert Bowen nodded briskly and patted the Televic helmet. "It was okay," he said. "Good show. A little talky at the beginning, and it needs a better fade-out, but the action scenes were fine. The sponsor ought to like it, for a while at least." "What you mean, for a while?" Robert Bowen sighed. "If this thing goes on the air the way it is, he'll lose sales." "Why? Commercial not good enough?" "Too good. Man, I've smoked Old Kings, and believe me, the real thing never tasted as good as that cigarette did in the commercial."
Were you as shocked by the ending as I was? We're talking 1962 here, and Garrett hit dead on where I think advertising is going these days. I doubt anyone has missed that recent TV commercials use more CGI than ever, and they try to tell you a story that centers on you buying this game or that proper brand of beer. I don't support the use of Old King's cigarettes, but I think you can see why Randall Garrett picked that for his story. What an amazing tale, and I want to thank you, Corey, for bringing it to my attention and bringing it to all of us. I do have a little surprise for everyone today. Ron's Amazing Stories has a brand new sponsor, and I'm proud to present Gladys's Goodies.
I'm Gladys, the dachshund, the face of Gladys Goodies. Are you worried about your pet's health? My parents were too, especially since I developed pancreatitis. They couldn't find any treats I could eat, so they made some. Our natural treats are healthy for all dogs, with and without health issues. We have lots of delicious flavors like chicken, turkey, salmon, sweet potato, beef, and more. With our homemade treats, you won't worry about the contents because they have no chemicals, fillers, or bad ingredients. Go to GladysGoodies.com now to get your fur friend a bag. And pick them up some swag while you're there. You'll be glad you did. Remember, we have the treats and swag to make their tails wag. Again, that's GladysGoodies.com. Again, that's GladysGoodies.com.
And now, back to the show. Growing up. We've all had to do it, or at least are trying to work on it. Some of us may never really accomplish it, and for others it is faded away too soon. Tom Williams, well, he's a lucky man. He lives in Berlin, Germany, was raised in Alabama, and sends in these tales from his youth. This time, Tom takes a break from his childhood to talk about his best friend and cousin, Fred, in a story he calls
Growing Up, Saturday in the Square. You've heard me mention my cousin Fred many times in previous stories, but I never mentioned that he was in a home for children during the week and had leave on weekends. Recently, I received his story of growing up there, and he asked me to read it to you. From Fred. I grew up in a small town in Alabama named Mobile and in a home for children. The home was built in 1864 by the Episcopal Church Diocese in order to take on orphans whose parents were Episcopal and whose families had lost fathers and brothers in the Civil War, which left them destitute and unable to properly support the child. Now, in 1949, at the age of 7, I was placed in this home. The orphanage consisted of 3 very large buildings of stucco outside walls and red tile roofs. The buildings were 3 stories tall. The top story was a huge attic. The buildings were constructed on a 10-acre lot. I, being totally bewildered and defenseless, struggled to fit in as the new kid. I learned the daily routine and tried to stay out of the way of the bad and mean guys so that I wouldn't get pounded. I did my best to learn the daily tasks of sweeping, mopping, and cleaning, and working in the kitchen. Everyone was required to do this in the mornings, afternoons, after school, and before supper. And we had to be finished with those chores before meals. Otherwise, if you were late, the doors would be closed to the dining hall. As you can see, punctuality was learned at an early age. By the time I was 10, I had learned my place, both in the pecking order and routine of life at the home. Having good manners among the other kids didn't matter, only the pecking order. I later on learned to mimic the manners of actors in the old movies. I found that you could learn a lot that way. Just stay in your place or move up if you could. By the age of 9, I was a seasoned fighter and could hold my own, even with the bigger and older kids. Now that I look back at those days, I have a certain amount of pride and also a lot of sadness that I had to live that way. Basically, I am a kind and gentle person. I was the kind of person who would win all the other kids' marbles in the playground and, in the end, give them back when I saw the sadness in their faces. I grew up in a crowd of kids, 9 kids in my dormitory and 10 in the other dormitory in the same building. I was the youngest. This made me want to get away by myself whenever I could. I often went exploring around the wooded swamp grounds of the orphanage. I was an avid bird watcher and could ultimately identify most all birds by their sound, even without seeing the actual bird, and this gave me great satisfaction. Another way of getting by myself, and on particularly windy days, I had a favorite oak tree on the property which I would climb to the very top and let the strong winds blow the limbs and me back and forth as if I were cradled in a mother's arms. I stayed there as long as possible. Saturdays provided another chance of getting away. Once we completed our chores, we were free to do whatever we wanted to. I informed the lady in charge of the building that I was going into town. She always advised me, more of a warning, to stay out of trouble and be back by 10. Around mid-morning, I grabbed my shoeshine box I had made, placed it into a brown paper bag, and set out for town. Now that I think of it, I'm not sure how the shoeshine box held together with all those people's feet on it, but it did. I would hitchhike the 7 miles into town. Even when the city bus came, I had the 15 cents. I never took it. I had to keep the money as backup just in case something didn't work out and I didn't make a usual $4 or $5 shining shoes that day. I knew I needed the 15 cents to return back to the orphanage on time. Drivers were reluctant to pick up hitchhikers, even a 10-year-old kid, after dark. In the heart of Mobile and in the business district is Bienville Square. In the center is a beautiful fountain, approximately 15 feet tall. Water cascades down from the very top over 3 levels and into a large basin or pool in the bottom. In the basin were goldfish and always coins on the bottom thrown in by visitors making their wishes. Throughout the square there were wrought iron benches. There were 4 sidewalks that led to the fountain. The many old oak trees provided shade on those hot southern days. There were numerous pigeons and squirrels scampering about. The pigeons were a cautious lot, but the squirrels were more trusting and would almost sit on your lap and eat from your hands. Not all, but some. They were mostly fed peanuts and sometimes breadcrumbs out of brown paper bags. At the east end of the square there was a large covered bandstand which stood about 8 feet off the ground and provided the public with restrooms beneath it and partly underground. Men's on one side and women's on the other. You always had to be careful and take a good look around to make sure there were no weirdos close by ready to follow you downstairs and stand by you at the urinal. After a while I took to relieving myself around the corner of the buildings. The square was at the center of town and business district with stores of all kinds surrounding it, spreading out for about 3 or 4 blocks. Then houses took over after that. Near the square were 2 of our favorite movie houses, and between the movie houses was a sandwich shop. The lady sold only hot dogs, various sandwiches, and an assortment of cold drinks. The kindly lady would always allow me to stash my shoeshine box and jacket behind her counter. Then I would go across the street and back to the square. I went into the public restroom and got a few handfuls of toilet paper. In those days, there were telephone booths on almost every corner. The phone calls were 10 cents, and when you made a call and no one answered, your dime was returned into a slot that was just big enough to get one finger into. If you put in a quarter, for example, and your call went through, you got your 15 cents back in the slot. I would take a bit of that toilet paper and stuff it into the slot. This would stop the return change from dropping into the change holder. I would generally plug up 10 or 12 phones within about a half hour. Then I would retrieve my shoeshine box and set out in the square near the fountain. I would check out the phones about every hour throughout the day, collect the change, if any, and replace the toilet paper. I usually didn't get much shoeshine business until afternoons and early evenings. About 2 blocks from the square, on a side street, there was a 2-story building. Upstairs was a house of ill repute, located on the 2nd floor. You opened the door from the sidewalk and went up the flight of stairs to a landing and opened another door, and there you were. There was always a man standing on the landing who would yell at me if I opened the door and looked inside. I hardly did that, but sometimes I would open the door just to hear him yell. I would set up outside the sidewalk door about a half a block away and catch the guys coming out. They always opened the door one of 2 ways, either slowly looking up and down the street or came bursting out holding their heads down. The slow open meant that they were always in a good mood and ready to talk business by the time they got to me, and I asked them about a shine. Good tippers, too, usually 50 cents for a quarter shine. They were always in a good mood. The guys that came bursting out looked ashamed and embarrassed. They were in a hurry to put distance between themselves and the scene of the crime. No business from them. By 4 p.m., I was generally pretty tired from checking phone booths and shining shoes. The last time I checked the booths, I would remove the toilet paper. I then deposited my shoeshine box behind the counter at the sandwich and juice place and checked out one of the 2 movies on the same block. By that time, I had enough money for hot dog, orange juice, and a nickel tip. I also had movie money, popcorn money, and bus fare home. The last bus left at 9 p.m., so the last thing I would generally do while downtown was to sit a while and listen to the Salvation Army band playing religious songs on the corner of the square. They were pretty good and had nice-looking uniforms, gray, trimmed in dark blue with military-style hats. Then on to the bus stop and back before 10 p.m. But when I got back, I was always careful to keep my money on me in my pocket at all times. Even when I went to bed, I slept with the money in my pajama pockets, lest it quickly disappear. When I took a shower, I put my money in my pants where I could watch them. There were many thieves there, mostly everyone. That was the one thing I never did. I had been stolen from several times until I learned better and knew how it felt. In a way, I felt sorry for them. They just absolutely had no way of getting anything. I was a thief too, but I only stole from phone booths on Saturdays. Fred. That ended Fred's story for me, but may I add the following? Growing up, we never discussed his life at the home, and that is why my picture of Fred's life in the home was totally different than what was just revealed. I always pictured Fred's life as greener pastures than my own. My life was always moving several times a year, never knowing if the next old house would be warm in the winter, far from schools with leaky roofs. I always pictured Fred's residence as being warm, with newer clothes and good regular meals. But here, in this letter he sent me, he revealed a side that I didn't know. So, the grass is never always greener on the other side. Sincerely, Tom.
Incredible story, Tom. To Fred, I say thank you for sharing that with us. I've always known that I've had it pretty easy. I never had to learn how to just survive. I think back on my life, and the closest thing I can come up with is having to cope with this distraction or maybe some setback. I often wonder at times, and if we really do appreciate our past, we can learn so much from what others have gone through in their lives. But sometimes, if we don't stop and listen, we'll miss it. Thank you, Fred, for taking us back to a simpler time, but maybe not necessarily a better one. Or was it? I leave that to you, the listener. Thank you, Tom, for your stories, and I can't wait to hear what you have for us next time. I want to thank Jeremy Vaughn, Corey Snow, and Tom Williams for being part of the show today. And do remember that I'm always looking for your stories, so if you have one, please send it in. Also, if you want to do that or just follow the podcast, head to ronsamazingstories.com. There you're going to find every link you'll need. Do you want to help us out? Please leave reviews and feedback on whatever service you use to listen to the show. It really does help us to grow. Thank you for listening, and I hope you come again to find out what are Ron's Amazing Stories.
All of the vintage audio used in the podcast is believed to be in the public domain. Ron's Amazing Stories does not own the rights to any of the old-time radio used here. If you hold the rights to any of the shows played, please contact us immediately at ronsamazingstories.com.